Money meant to help poor Mississippians was instead used to buy expensive cars and pay former NFL and Hall of Fame quarterback Brett Favre for a speech that he never gave. More than $94 million in welfare spending was questioned by auditors.
It's now been revealed that the Mississippi Department of Human Services is being held responsible for misspending thousands of welfare dollars that has now become Mississippi's largest embezzlement scandal on record. Joining us now to talk about this 104-page audit is Shad White. He is the 42nd state auditor of Mississippi, who assumed office in July 2018 after being appointed by Governor Phil Bryant. Welcome to BNC Now, Auditor White.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
This is huge. Why don't you start by telling us, how did this happen without anyone realizing there was a problem?
Sure. Well, to give a little bit of background, in Mississippi, a lot of TANF money, that's temporary assistance for needy families, flows through a state agency called the Department of Human Services here. And so last year, middle of last year, my office, which includes 135 CPAs, investigators, and attorneys, we got a tip in that suggested that the director of the Department of Human Services was misdirecting money and potentially involved in an embezzlement scheme. So we started investigating that tip, and what we ultimately found was that 6 individuals had committed a variety of criminal violations. So in February, we arrested those individuals. Those arrests really, in sum total, came to the largest public embezzlement scandal in Mississippi history on record in my office. And then fast forward a couple of months, just last week, we released an audit of that same state agency. And what we found was that about $94 million worth of TANF money that should have been spent to benefit needy people here in Mississippi had likely been misspent, meaning that we either identified that the money had been spent on things that they're not legally allowed to be spent on, like cars for staffers or speeches for sports heroes, or we could not identify the documents that would justify the spending. So we take those two big universes of money, we put them together, and we found ultimately that $94 million of your money, of TANF money that should have gone to benefit poor folks, likely went somewhere else.
Mr. White, obviously that's a massive amount of money, $94 million. Will it eventually go to the right people, and when?
So the next phase in this process is we take this audit, the thing that we built as a result of all of our investigation, and we send that up to the federal government. The federal government then takes that, and it's the Department of HHS, Health and Human Services. They will take this audit that we have produced, and they'll look at it and they'll try to identify the exact amount of money that went to the wrong places. So we question $94 million worth of spending. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they decide that only $60 million was misspent. They have a variety of different things they can do once they make that decision. They can, for instance, require the state of Mississippi to kick in $60 million of money to go to TANF beneficiaries. They could levy a penalty on the state of Mississippi. They could cut our future TANF grant as well, money that's coming down from the federal government. So there's a lot of different things they can do, and ultimately that decision is left up to them. What I can tell you, in addition to that, is that while they are making that decision, we have stated pretty openly that it might be a good idea for some of these folks who have benefited from this money to give it back. So, for example, last week, Brett Favre cut a $500,000 check back to the state of Mississippi, and that money will be held by my office in a clearing account for a little while, and then we will forward it in full over to the Department of Human Services to be spent on TANF recipients.
A lot of people kind of question Brett Favre, saying that he didn't know he got this money, and it's great that he returned it, but it just seemed really odd that he had that money there. Will you be doing any investigations, or will any state officials investigate, third parties such as Brett Favre who had money that they shouldn't have?
It's a good question. So what I'll tell you is we've already made 6 arrests in this case, and our criminal investigation into those 6 individuals, anything else they might have done, and anybody else who was involved in this case is still ongoing. In addition to that, we have forwarded all of our information over to the FBI and all of our information over to the Office of Inspector General. Those 2 entities are also engaging in an investigation. So really what's going to happen is you'll have a lot of different entities pouring a lot of resources at this to identify anybody who has done anything that is in violation of any criminal statute. Now, in addition to that, we all know that sometimes misspending happens, but the recipients don't necessarily violate any criminal laws. In fact, in this case, we see evidence that some folks got money, they got TANF money, but they didn't actually know where the money came from. So there are going to be plenty of people who unfortunately got this money, who may pay it back, who may feel very guilty about the fact that they ended up with the money, but they never really did anything wrong in the first place. They just happened to be on the receiving end of money that, as it turns out, was TANF money.
And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. White, the last that I heard, Favre's agent, Bus Cook, stated that they had no comment. Is that correct?
Well, I know that Mr. Favre made a few comments last week, and generally it was to the effect of, look, I paid the money back. And you know, I think there was some question on their end about whether or not they got paid money for speeches or whether it was for public service announcements. What I can tell you is that there is a contract that exists between the nonprofit who did a lot of the TANF spending and Favre Enterprises. The contract is signed by the CFO of Favre Enterprises, and it states pretty plainly that Mr. Favre is being paid for 3 speaking engagements, 1 keynote address, and 1 radio ad. So again, you know, that's not to say that that information made its way to Mr. Favre. It's not to say that he was told that these specific speaking engagements were the ones he had to go to. In fact, when we asked the nonprofit, okay, well, what speeches was Brett Favre giving in order to get this $1.1 million, they gave us some dates and events, and we could determine that he very clearly was not there at those events. So there's a lot of confusion, I would say, around what information got to which individuals. But ultimately, what we know is that the people at the nonprofit, the folks who took this money from the state, they took taxpayer money, and then they doled it out. Those folks are ultimately responsible for this because they were the ones who knew it was all TANF money, and they were the ones who were responsible for making sure it got to the benefit of folks who are TANF eligible.
All right. Real quickly, Mr. White, I started my career there in Hattiesburg. In about 15 seconds or less, how can the state make sure that this type of fraud does not occur again?
What we need to do is institute more and serious controls at our Department of Human Services. We have to make sure there are multiple eyeballs on every dollar. And really, to be honest with you, the main thing that I think my office can do is to prosecute these problems, or at least investigate and forward these problems to prosecutors, to send the message constantly that public money in Mississippi is being watched and you have to do the right thing with it.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much, State Auditor Shad White from Mississippi. We appreciate your time here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.